Some books stay locked for a reason, and sometimes the greatest curse begins with a single spoken word. Every Tuesday morning before the first visitor wandered through the heavy oak doors, Charlotte Hayes unlocked the century-old Ashcroft Public Library with the same quiet ritual. She switched on the brass reading lamps one by one, rolled open the tall windows overlooking the sleepy streets of Blackwood, Vermont, and breathed in the familiar scent of aged paper, cedar shelves, and dust warmed by early sunlight. The building was older than anyone could accurately date. Local historians claimed it had survived fires, floods, and 2 wars without losing its original foundation. Tourists admired its stained glass windows. Children loved the spiral staircase that seemed to disappear into shadows above. Charlotte loved the silence. It was the only place in town where the world seemed willing to slow down. At 28, she lived alone in a small apartment above an aging bakery 3 blocks away. Her paycheck barely covered rent, groceries, and student loans, but she never complained. Books had given her comfort when nothing else had. Now she spent her days returning that kindness to strangers searching for stories of their own. That morning felt strangely different before she even realized why. The old grandfather clock near the entrance had stopped exactly at 8:17, though she had wound it the evening before. The temperature inside the library felt cooler than the crisp October air outside. A faint breeze drifted through the archive hallway, even though every window there remained tightly sealed. Charlotte paused beside the information desk and frowned toward the restricted basement door. Visitors were never allowed below. Most employees avoided it completely. The archive contained fragile collections donated by wealthy families decades earlier, along with manuscripts no museum had ever requested. Her supervisor jokingly called it the library's forgotten basement. Unfortunately for Charlotte, forgotten places often remembered things no one else could. Less than a mile away, hidden beneath towering maple trees beyond an abandoned stone estate, another silence had lasted for centuries. No heartbeat disturbed the darkness. No footsteps crossed the cold marble floor. Only ancient symbols carved into black stone waited patiently beneath layers of dust that no living hand had touched in generations. Charlotte knew nothing about any of it. She simply noticed a maintenance cart blocking the archive entrance. Mr. Alden rarely forgot his equipment. She walked downstairs carrying a flashlight. The air smelled faintly of rain, although the basement was completely dry. Her footsteps echoed softly against narrow stone walls lined with locked cabinets bearing faded brass labels. Most drawers held forgotten newspapers or handwritten journals. One cabinet stood slightly open. She could have ignored it. Instead, curiosity gently pulled her closer. Inside rested a single leather-bound volume wrapped in cracked black cloth, unlike anything she had ever catalogued. There was no library barcode. No title appeared on the spine. Only an unusual silver seal shaped like a crown surrounded by thorn-like vines. Charlotte carefully lifted the surprisingly warm book into her hands. The cloth slipped away almost by itself. Fine lettering shimmered across the cover for only a second before fading back into worn leather. She blinked, convinced the dim flashlight had played tricks on her eyes. "That's strange," she whispered, brushing away decades of dust. The cover opened with almost no effort despite its obvious age. The pages looked untouched, perfectly preserved, filled with elegant symbols that resembled Latin but flowed with unfamiliar patterns she had never studied. She smiled awkwardly. Definitely not English. Then something impossible happened. As sunlight from the stairwell reached the page, several lines slowly rearranged themselves into flawless modern English. Charlotte stared in stunned silence, believing exhaustion had finally caught up with her. Every librarian understood that old ink could fade. No librarian expected ancient words to rewrite themselves. She swallowed once, leaned slightly closer, and quietly read the first sentence aloud without thinking. The basement lights flickered. Somewhere deep beneath the building, stone groaned like an old structure awakening from sleep. A gust of icy air swept through the archive, extinguishing her flashlight even though its batteries were brand new. Charlotte looked around, confused, clutching the mysterious book against her chest. What she didn't know was that the forgotten sentence she had just spoken had not been read aloud by any human voice for more than 400 years. Charlotte stood motionless in the cold basement, her flashlight lifeless in one hand and the mysterious book pressed against her sweater with the other. The silence that followed felt different from ordinary silence. It carried weight, as though the walls themselves were listening. A faint metallic sound echoed somewhere beyond the rows of forgotten shelves. It lasted only a second before disappearing completely. She forced herself to take a slow breath and glance toward the old maintenance cart. It remained exactly where she had found it, yet one of its wheels was turning ever so slightly even though there was no breeze strong enough to move it. She told herself there had to be a logical explanation. Old buildings shifted, pipes expanded, electricity failed, libraries were full of strange noises, especially ones built before the Civil War. She carefully lowered the ancient book onto a nearby wooden table, intending to close it and return upstairs. The moment her fingertips left the cover, every page began turning by itself. Not quickly, not violently, slowly, deliberately. One page after another moved as though guided by invisible hands searching for something they had waited centuries to find. Charlotte reached toward the book again, but the pages stopped the instant her skin touched the leather binding. The room became still once more. Her pulse quickened. She looked down and realized the silver seal on the cover no longer appeared dull with age. It reflected the dim emergency lights like polished metal. She swallowed hard and whispered to herself that she needed to tell someone. Mr. Alden would know whether the archive contained undocumented collections. Perhaps the county museum had forgotten records. Maybe the university in Burlington could identify the language. She closed the book firmly, wrapped it in the black cloth exactly as she had found it, and carried it upstairs. The warmth of the main reading room should have felt comforting. Instead, every familiar corner seemed strangely unfamiliar. Sunlight still poured through the stained glass windows, scattering colors across polished wooden floors. But several patrons had quietly gathered near the circulation desk with puzzled expressions. A young mother looked toward Charlotte the moment she appeared. "Did you feel that?" she asked softly. The lights blinked and every clock stopped for a few seconds. Charlotte looked around. She had not noticed before. The digital computer displays all showed the same frozen time, 8:17. The grandfather clock remained silent. Even visitors checked their wristwatches with confused smiles before every clock suddenly resumed at exactly the same moment. Nervous laughter spread through the room and conversation slowly returned. Charlotte forced a polite smile. Probably just a power fluctuation. The explanation sounded reasonable enough for everyone else. It did not convince her. Less than 5 miles outside Blackwood, hidden beyond thick forests where no public road appeared on any tourist map, ravens lifted from dead branches without making a sound. Beneath an abandoned stone manor forgotten by local history, dozens of candles that had not burned in generations suddenly ignited with pale silver flames. Ancient portraits hanging along dark corridors shifted ever so slightly. Dust drifted through motionless air. Deep inside the estate, behind enormous iron doors covered with faded carvings, a single crack spread across a circular stone seal that had remained untouched for 400 years. No human eyes witnessed it. Back inside the library, Charlotte placed the wrapped book inside a temporary archival box and locked it inside her office cabinet. She intended to document everything before anyone else handled it. Yet as she reached for the inventory log, she noticed something impossible. Fine grey dust coated the wooden desk around the cabinet. In the center of that dust rested one perfectly clear handprint. It was much larger than hers. Long, elegant fingers, sharp, graceful lines. As though someone had rested a hand there only moments earlier, she stared without breathing. The office door had remained locked all morning. No one else possessed the key except her supervisor, who had not even arrived yet. Slowly she reached toward the strange mark. Before her fingertips could touch the dust, the library telephone rang so suddenly that she nearly jumped. The shrill sound shattered the silence. She answered with a trembling voice. The caller did not introduce himself. For several long seconds there was only calm breathing on the other end of the line before a quiet male voice finally spoke. "Whatever book you found," he said with unsettling certainty, "do not open it again. Someone has already awakened." Charlotte tightened her grip on the telephone receiver, but before she could ask a single question, the line went silent. No click, no goodbye. Only the faint static of an empty connection lingered for another heartbeat before disappearing completely. She slowly lowered the receiver, staring at the office wall as if it might explain what had just happened. The words echoed inside her mind with unsettling clarity. Someone has already awakened. She immediately dialed the number shown on the caller identification screen. Instead of ringing, the display flashed an unfamiliar message. "Number unavailable." She tried again. The same result appeared. Her office suddenly felt much smaller than it had only minutes earlier. Charlotte walked back to the locked cabinet and hesitated before opening it. The ancient book rested exactly where she had placed it inside the archival box. Wrapped in its worn black cloth, nothing seemed different until she noticed the temperature. The cabinet felt noticeably colder than the rest of the room, as though winter air had somehow become trapped inside the wooden shelves. She gently touched the cloth. It was dry, but the leather beneath seemed almost warm enough to be alive. A knock at the office door startled her. "Charlotte," Mr. Alden called with his usual cheerful voice. "Everything all right in there?" She quickly closed the cabinet. "Yes." "I was just organizing some archive records." The elderly custodian stepped inside carrying his toolbox. His weathered face looked unusually pale. "Funny morning," he said quietly. "Elevator stopped by itself. Every smoke detector reset at once. Even the old security cameras froze for exactly 17 seconds. Charlotte forced herself to sound casual. "Have you ever seen a leather book wrapped in black cloth down in the basement archives?" Mr. Alden stopped smiling almost immediately. "Where exactly?" "One of the old cabinets near the east storage room." He remained silent long enough that Charlotte noticed his hands tightening around the toolbox handle. "That cabinet was supposed to be empty," he finally answered. "It has been sealed longer than I have worked here. Maybe someone forgot to catalogue it." Mr. Alden slowly shook his head. "Nobody forgets that room." Before Charlotte could ask another question, the library entrance bell chimed. Several visitors stepped inside, bringing with them the ordinary sounds of another workday. Mr. Alden glanced toward the front desk before quietly adding, "If you found something unusual, do not stay late tonight." Then he walked away without another explanation. Charlotte watched him disappear between the bookshelves, wondering why a man who joked with everyone suddenly looked afraid of an old library cabinet. Across town, Blackwood continued its peaceful routine. School buses rolled through quiet neighborhoods. Cafes filled with morning customers, maple leaves drifted across sidewalks beneath bright autumn skies. No one noticed the flock of ravens circling above Ashcroft Hill in perfect silence. No one questioned why every dog in the neighborhood refused to walk near the old cemetery bordering the forest. Less than a mile beyond those trees, hidden beneath the abandoned stone estate, another change unfolded. The crack across its ancient seal widened by the width of a single coin. Fine silver light escaped through the narrow opening before fading into darkness once more. Deep within the chamber, the sound of slow breathing returned for the first time in 4 centuries. It was steady, patient. Charlotte spent the next several hours helping visitors locate history books, checking out novels, and answering questions about genealogy records, yet her attention kept drifting back toward the locked office cabinet. Every few minutes she caught herself glancing in its direction without realizing it. Shortly after noon, a delivery driver entered, carrying a small overnight package addressed directly to her. She frowned. She had not ordered anything. The return address simply read Blackwood Historical Society. Curious, she signed for the package and carefully opened it at her desk. Inside rested a single yellowed envelope tied with faded blue ribbon. There was no letter, no explanation. Only one black and white photograph taken decades earlier. It showed the library staff standing proudly in front of Ashcroft Public Library sometime around 1923. Charlotte studied each familiar face until her breathing slowed. Near the center of the photograph stood one tall man wearing a dark overcoat. His face appeared remarkably clear despite the age of the picture. Pale features, dark hair, calm gray eyes fixed directly toward the camera. She had never seen him before, yet something about him felt strangely familiar. She turned the photograph over. Written neatly across the back were only 7 words. "He came for the book once before." Then, almost as if responding to those words, someone knocked gently 3 times on the library's front door, even though the building was still open and no one stood outside. Charlotte remained frozen behind the circulation desk, her eyes fixed on the library's glass entrance. 3 gentle knocks had echoed through the building, even though no one stood outside. The afternoon sunlight still spilled across the front steps, revealing empty sidewalks, parked cars, and maple leaves drifting lazily through the breeze. Several visitors looked up from their books, puzzled by the sound, but after finding no one at the door, they quietly returned to reading. Charlotte stepped toward the entrance anyway. She unlocked the heavy brass handle and slowly pulled the door open. Cool autumn air rushed inside. The street was peaceful. Across the road, the owner of the flower shop watered potted chrysanthemums. A delivery truck rolled past without slowing down. Everything looked completely ordinary except for one object resting neatly on the welcome mat. It was a single white lily, freshly cut, no ribbon, no note. Charlotte bent down and carefully picked it up. Tiny drops of water still clung to its petals as though it had been placed there only seconds earlier. She looked in every direction but found no one watching her. When she carried the flower back inside, an elderly woman seated near the history shelves quietly smiled. "That is unusual," she said. "Lilies never bloom this late around Blackwood." Charlotte politely thanked her, although the comment unsettled her even more. She placed the flower inside a glass of water behind the desk, trying to focus on work again. Yet the strange photograph and the anonymous phone call refused to leave her thoughts. During her lunch break, she searched through the library's employee records, hoping to identify the pale man standing in the 1923 photograph. She expected faded personnel files or forgotten newspaper articles. Instead, she found nothing. His face appeared nowhere else. Every staff portrait before and after that year listed complete names beneath each employee, except for the man in the overcoat. The space beneath him remained blank, as though someone had deliberately removed his identity. Charlotte frowned. Libraries preserved everything. Missing information rarely happened by accident. Unfortunately for her, someone else had already noticed she was searching. Less than 2 miles away, inside a modest brick building that served as Blackwood Historical Society, a locked filing cabinet slowly swung open without human hands. Several yellow documents slid gently onto the wooden floor. One brittle envelope carried the same silver crown symbol Charlotte had seen on the mysterious book. Across the front, someone had written 3 words in elegant handwriting: "Do not return." The building remained empty. No alarm sounded. Back at the library, Mr. Alden approached carrying a small cardboard box. "Found this while cleaning the attic," he said. "Thought you might want it." Inside rested several old library ledgers tied together with fading string. Charlotte thanked him and carried them into her office. The oldest ledger dated back more than 100 years. She carefully turned each fragile page, scanning handwritten inventories and donation records until one short entry immediately caught her attention. October 14, 1923. Restricted manuscript transferred to lower archive by private request. Custodian instructed never to display publicly. Authorization signed. The signature line had been completely scratched away. Charlotte looked toward the wrapped book inside her cabinet. The date matched the photograph almost exactly. Before she could continue reading, something softly tapped against her office window. She looked up expecting a tree branch. Instead, she saw a raven perched calmly on the narrow stone ledge outside. Its glossy black feathers shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. The bird did not move. It simply watched her with remarkable stillness. Charlotte hesitated before stepping closer. The raven tilted its head once, then spread its wings and disappeared into the sky without making a sound. As she returned to the ledger, a folded piece of paper slipped from between 2 brittle pages and drifted onto her desk. The note looked much newer than the century-old book around it. Someone had hidden it there decades after the ledger was written. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was hurried but elegant. "If anyone ever speaks the first passage aloud, do not let the king find the reader first." Charlotte read the sentence twice before quietly lowering the paper. Her breathing slowed. The anonymous caller had warned her that someone had awakened. The photograph suggested a mysterious man had once searched for the same book. Now another unknown writer feared a king discovering whoever had read it aloud. None of it made sense. Yet every clue pointed toward the same impossible secret. Then, just as the afternoon sunlight began fading across the stained glass windows, the white lily behind the circulation desk opened completely in a single silent moment, and every security camera inside the library simultaneously turned toward Charlotte. Charlotte stood perfectly still as every security camera inside Ashcroft Public Library settled into the same position. Each black lens pointed directly toward her desk. The soft mechanical movement lasted only a few seconds before complete silence returned. A teenage volunteer looked up from shelving books and laughed nervously. "That was weird," he said. "Maybe the system is rebooting." Charlotte forced a smile, but her attention never left the cameras. They had never moved together before. She quietly walked into the security office near the staff entrance and pulled up the live monitor feeds. Every hallway appeared normal. Every reading room remained peaceful. Children sat cross-legged listening to story time. College students studied near the reference section. Elderly visitors turned newspaper pages beneath warm reading lamps, yet every camera displayed one impossible detail. No matter which room appeared on the screen, Charlotte herself could be seen somewhere in the frame. When she stood inside the security office, camera 4 somehow showed her reflection passing through the history aisle. Camera 7 captured her standing beside the circulation desk. Camera 11 displayed her walking near the basement staircase. None of those places matched where she actually stood. She leaned closer, convinced it had to be an electronic malfunction. The recorded timestamps all matched the current minute. Every version of herself wore the same clothes and carried the same expression. Then, one by one, the images disappeared until only her real location remained on every monitor. Charlotte slowly stepped backward. Before she could process what she had witnessed, Mr. Alden entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He noticed her pale face. He asked kindly. She almost told him everything: the strange phone call, the anonymous photograph, the impossible cameras. Instead, she simply nodded. "I think I need some fresh air." He handed her one of the cups. "Go home early if you need to. I can close tonight." Charlotte thanked him, but something stopped her from leaving. Every clue pointed back to the mysterious book. Walking away now felt impossible. Outside, the afternoon sky slowly turned grey as clouds gathered above Blackwood. A light breeze carried the scent of rain through the open windows. Across town, shop owners began bringing signs indoors while children hurried home from school. The town looked peaceful, but subtle changes continued spreading unnoticed. Birds no longer landed on the library roof. Church bells missed a single chime at exactly 4 o'clock before correcting themselves. Even the old fountain in the town square briefly flowed backward for several seconds before returning to normal. No one seemed to notice except an elderly man feeding pigeons. He quietly crossed himself and left without finishing his bread. Less than 5 miles beyond town, hidden beneath towering pines, they no longer felt completely abandoned. Candles continued burning inside empty halls. Ancient portraits seemed brighter than before. Deep below the manor, the cracked seal surrounding the forgotten chamber widened another fraction of an inch. Dust drifted downward from the ceiling as though the entire structure had exhaled after centuries of waiting. Back inside the library, Charlotte finally unlocked the office cabinet once more. She carefully unwrapped the ancient volume but deliberately avoided opening it. Instead, she examined the leather cover under a desk lamp. Tiny patterns she had overlooked earlier now shimmered faintly beneath the surface. They resembled winding branches surrounding the silver crown emblem, but hidden among them she discovered something else. Small letters had been carved so delicately they became visible only when light struck from the side. "Protect the voice, not the words." Charlotte whispered the sentence to herself without reading anything from inside the book. "Protect the voice, not the words." She frowned. The message sounded less like a warning and more like an instruction left for whoever found the manuscript. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. Unlike the mysterious knocking earlier, this one came from the office door. She looked up, expecting Mr. Alden. Instead, a young courier wearing a grey delivery jacket stood politely in the hallway holding a slim envelope. "Special delivery for Miss Hayes," he said. "No signature required." Charlotte accepted it with surprise. The courier smiled politely, turned around and disappeared toward the exit. She opened the envelope immediately. Inside rested a single cream-colored invitation embossed with the same silver crown she had seen on the mysterious book. There was no mailing address, no postage, only elegant handwriting. "Miss Charlotte Hayes, your presence is respectfully requested at Ashcroft Manor this evening at 7 o'clock. Transportation will be waiting." Beneath the message appeared one final line written in smaller script. "You have already met the curse. It is time to meet the man who carries it." Charlotte stared at the invitation for several long seconds before carefully placing it beside the mysterious photograph on her desk. Ashcroft Manor did not appear on any current town map. She had lived in Blackwood for almost 5 years and had never heard anyone mention it except in scattered local legends about an abandoned estate hidden somewhere beyond the northern forest. Yet whoever had sent the invitation clearly knew her name, knew about the book, and somehow knew she had already become connected to the ancient mystery unfolding around her. She checked the time. It was just after 5 o'clock. 2 hours remained before the meeting. Logic told her to call the police or at least tell Mr. Alden everything. Curiosity whispered something stronger. She quietly slipped the invitation into her shoulder bag before locking the office cabinet once again. As she stepped into the main reading room, Mr. Alden was finishing repairs on one of the old bookshelves. He looked up with the same gentle smile he always wore, but the moment his eyes landed on Charlotte's face, the smile faded ever so slightly. "You have decided to go," he said softly. Charlotte stopped walking. "How did you know?" The old custodian carefully wiped his hands with a cloth before answering. "Because everyone who ever found that book received an invitation." Charlotte felt her heartbeat quicken. You knew about it? Mr. Alden nodded slowly. I knew enough to hope nobody would ever open that cabinet again. He reached into his toolbox and removed a tiny brass key attached to a worn leather cord. The metal looked older than anything Charlotte had ever held. Strange symbols circled its handle, almost identical to the patterns carved into the mysterious book. Take this, he said. It opens one door inside the manor. I cannot tell you which one, because I never reached it myself. Charlotte accepted the key with trembling fingers. You have been there? Many years ago. His voice became quieter. I was younger than you are now. I believed knowledge alone could solve every mystery. I was wrong. Before Charlotte could ask another question, Mr. Alden gently placed one hand over hers. Listen carefully. When you meet him, do not judge him by the stories people have forgotten. Watch what he protects. That will tell you who he truly is. Those words lingered between them even after neither spoke again. Outside, rain finally began falling over Blackwood. Not a violent storm, only a soft, steady rain that painted the sidewalk silver beneath the fading evening light. By 6:30, the library had closed. Visitors drifted home carrying borrowed novels beneath umbrellas while Charlotte switched off the reading lamps one by one. The familiar building suddenly felt reluctant to let her leave. Every quiet corner seemed filled with memories she could not explain. She paused beside the circulation desk where the white lily still rested in its glass vase. Instead of fading, the flower looked even fresher than before. Its petals glowed softly beneath the dim lights. Charlotte gently touched one delicate petal before picking up her coat and stepping outside. Waiting across the empty street stood a long black sedan she had never seen before. No company logo appeared on the polished doors. The driver, dressed in a charcoal suit, stepped out and respectfully opened the rear passenger door without saying a word. Charlotte hesitated only a moment before climbing inside. The warm leather seats carried the faint scent of cedar and old parchment rather than expensive perfume. The driver quietly closed the door and the car pulled away without asking for directions. As Blackwood disappeared behind them, the road narrowed into a winding path through dense maple forests. Rain tapped softly against the windows while twilight settled over the mountains. Charlotte noticed something unusual. The farther they drove, the quieter the world became. No passing cars, no birds, no distant traffic. Even the sound of rainfall seemed strangely muted. Unfortunately for Charlotte, someone else had already been waiting for her arrival long before the invitation had ever been delivered. Beyond the trees, hidden behind towering iron gates wrapped in ivy, hundreds of warm lights slowly illuminated the windows of Ashcroft Manor, one room after another. As though the ancient estate had awakened alongside its forgotten master, the sedan rolled through the open gates without stopping. Charlotte looked through the rain-speckled window and caught her first glimpse of the manor rising from the hillside. Massive stone walls reflected the pale evening sky. Tall towers reached above the surrounding forest. Warm golden light glowed behind elegant windows that should have belonged to a place full of life instead of a building the entire town believed had been abandoned for generations. The car stopped beneath a grand covered entrance. Before the driver could open her door, the enormous front doors of the manor slowly swung inward on their own, revealing a long candlelit hallway where a single tall figure already stood waiting in complete silence. Charlotte remained inside the car for one final heartbeat, staring through the open doorway of Ashcroft Manor. The figure waiting beneath the chandeliers did not move to greet her. He simply stood with perfect stillness, one hand resting lightly behind his back, the other at his side. The warm candlelight revealed a man who appeared no older than his early 30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that seemed almost untouched by time. His dark hair framed sharp features that belonged more naturally in an old portrait than in the modern world. His skin was remarkably pale, almost luminous against the polished mahogany walls surrounding him. Most striking of all were his eyes. Even from several yards away, they carried a quiet silver-grey color that reflected the candlelight with unusual clarity. Charlotte stepped from the sedan. The driver silently closed the door behind her and returned to the vehicle without a word. Moments later, the car disappeared down the long driveway, leaving only the sound of gentle rain falling beyond the stone columns. The man waited until Charlotte reached the entrance before speaking. "Miss Hayes," he said calmly. His voice was deep, composed, and strangely familiar. Charlotte immediately recognized it. It was the same voice that had warned her over the telephone that morning. "You called the library," she said quietly. He inclined his head slightly. "I did. You knew about the book before I found it." "I knew someone studied him carefully. Nothing about his posture suggested hostility, yet every movement carried quiet authority, as though the house itself answered to him. "Who are you?" she finally asked. He looked at her for a long moment before answering with complete honesty. "My name is Adrian Moretti." The name stirred no memory, but something inside Charlotte felt unexpectedly calmer after hearing it spoken aloud. Adrian stepped aside and gestured toward the entrance hall. "Please come inside. You have traveled farther than you realize." Charlotte hesitated only briefly before crossing the threshold. Warm air immediately surrounded her. The entrance hall glowed beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected soft golden light across marble floors. Shelves filled with beautifully preserved books stretched upward along the walls. Massive fireplaces burned quietly despite the mild autumn weather. Instead of feeling abandoned, the manor felt patiently maintained, as though its owner had expected visitors every day for centuries. Charlotte noticed framed paintings lining the staircase. Some depicted landscapes. Others showed men and women dressed in clothing from different eras. One portrait immediately caught her attention. It showed the same man standing before her now, wearing formal clothing from another century. He looked exactly the same. Not older, not younger. She slowly turned back toward Adrian. "That painting cannot be recent." "No," he answered softly. "It was completed in 1826. Charlotte looked from the portrait to his face again. "That is impossible." Adrian offered no argument. He merely continued walking through the hallway until they entered an elegant library unlike anything Charlotte had ever imagined. Thousands of carefully preserved volumes filled towering shelves beneath a painted ceiling. A fire crackled quietly in a wide stone hearth. Two chairs faced one another beside a polished walnut table already prepared with tea. Adrian waited until Charlotte sat before taking the opposite chair. "There are many questions you deserve answered," he said. "But if I explain everything at once, nothing will make sense." Charlotte folded her hands together. "Start with the truth." Adrian nodded once. "Very well, the book you found was never forbidden because of what it contained." Charlotte frowned. "Then why hide it?" Adrian looked toward the fire before answering. "Because the first page is not knowledge, it is a key." Silence settled between them. Charlotte remembered the strange words rearranging themselves into English. She remembered reading only one sentence aloud. "I unlocked something," she whispered. Adrian slowly met her eyes again. "Yes, the curse, part of it." Charlotte waited for him to continue, but he remained quiet. Finally, she asked the question that had haunted her since morning. "Are you the king mentioned in the note?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and carefully placed a familiar black and white photograph on the table between them. It was identical to the one Charlotte had received at the library, except this copy had never faded with age. Every detail remained perfectly sharp. Adrian gently rested one finger upon the pale man standing at the center of the 1923 library staff. "That photograph was taken 100 years ago," he said. "The man standing there is me." Charlotte looked from the photograph to the man sitting quietly across from her. Every impossible clue suddenly aligned into one undeniable truth. Before she could speak another word, the grandfather clock somewhere deep inside the manor struck exactly 8 times, and every candle throughout the room burned with a sudden silver flame. Charlotte could not take her eyes off the photograph resting on the walnut table. The man in the century-old image and the man sitting quietly across from her shared every feature, the same calm expression, the same silver-grey eyes. Even the way one hand rested lightly against his coat appeared identical. Nothing about him suggested illusion or trickery. The impossible truth simply existed, waiting for her to decide whether she could accept it. Adrian gently folded the photograph and returned it to his pocket without breaking the silence. He seemed unusually patient, allowing Charlotte the time to gather her thoughts instead of overwhelming her with explanations. Finally, she looked up. "You have not changed in 100 years, Adrian answered with complete honesty. "Much longer than that." Charlotte slowly shook her head. "Then everything people whispered about this place began with fragments of truth," he finished quietly. The silver flames dancing upon every candle gradually softened until they became ordinary golden light once more. Charlotte noticed that Adrian had not reacted to the strange change at all. It was as though he had expected it. "Was that because of me?" she asked. Adrian glanced briefly toward the fireplace before answering. "Not intentionally. The manor responds whenever the old curse stirs." Charlotte frowned. "You keep calling it a curse, but nobody has explained what it actually is." Adrian stood and slowly walked toward one of the towering bookshelves. He removed an elegant wooden box carved with the same silver crown symbol she had already seen several times that day. Returning to the table, he carefully opened the lid. Inside rested dozens of handwritten letters bundled together with faded ribbons. Some looked centuries old, others appeared surprisingly modern. Charlotte expected ancient relics or magical objects. Instead, she found ordinary paper. Adrian gently lifted the oldest letter and placed it before her. He said, "Someone has awakened the first page." Charlotte looked down at the graceful handwriting. The date at the top read April 17, 1709. Another letter beneath it carried the year 1764, another 1823, another 1923. Each belonged to a different century. "These people all found the same book?" she asked. Adrian nodded. They each read the opening passage without understanding what it truly was. Charlotte carefully traced the edge of one fragile page without touching the ink. What happened to them? Adrian remained silent for several moments. They lived their lives. Charlotte looked up, surprised. "That is all?" The curse was never placed upon the reader. Charlotte blinked. "Then who suffers from it?" Adrian slowly met her eyes. "I do." The room fell completely still. Charlotte remembered the invitation describing the man who carried the curse. Until that moment, she had assumed the ancient book itself had been dangerous. Now she realized the manuscript had never been the prisoner. It had been the lock. "You said I awakened only part of it," she whispered. Adrian nodded once. "The first passage announces that the seal has weakened, nothing more." Charlotte released a quiet breath she had not realized she was holding. Then why were people so desperate to hide it? Adrian walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking the rain-covered gardens. Outside, fountains reflected the evening sky, while rows of white lilies surrounded dark stone pathways. "Because every time the seal weakens," he said softly, "others begin searching for the person who opened it." Charlotte immediately remembered the mysterious notes, the anonymous warnings, and the impossible events inside the library. "Someone besides you?" Adrian looked back over his shoulder. "Yes." Adrian chose his words carefully. "They believe ending my curse is worth any cost." Charlotte studied him quietly. Despite everything she had witnessed, he had never threatened her, demanded the book, or treated her as anything other than an honored guest. Every warning she had received urged her to fear the king, yet every action she observed suggested someone carrying an enormous burden rather than abusing great power. Her attention drifted toward the rain outside. "Then why invite me here?" Adrian returned to the table. "Because I wanted you to hear the truth from me before anyone else reached you with lies." Charlotte slowly nodded. For the first time since discovering the ancient manuscript, one question rose above every other mystery. "If the curse belongs to you," she asked gently, "why has it lasted this long?" Adrian lowered his eyes for the first time that evening. His answer came almost as a quiet confession. "Because 400 years ago, I made a promise that I refused to break, even after everyone else forgot why it had been made." Before Charlotte could ask what promise could survive 4 centuries, 3 soft chimes echoed somewhere beneath the manor, and Adrian's calm expression changed ever so slightly, as though he had just realized someone unexpected had crossed the estate gates. The 3 quiet chimes faded into silence, but their effect lingered throughout the manor. Charlotte noticed it immediately. The servants who had been moving discreetly through the hallways stopped where they stood. The distant music drifting from another room disappeared. Even the rain beyond the tall windows seemed to lose its rhythm for a brief moment. Adrian remained perfectly still beside the table, listening with an attention that suggested the sound had carried far more meaning than an ordinary bell. Charlotte slowly rose from her chair. "What was that?" she asked. Adrian looked toward the closed library doors. "Someone has arrived without an invitation." His voice remained calm, but Charlotte sensed a subtle change she had not seen before. Not fear, vigilance. He reached into his pocket and removed a small silver key unlike the brass one Mr. Alden had given her. Without explanation, he placed it beside her teacup. "Keep this with you," he said quietly. "It opens every interior door in this house except one." Charlotte looked at the key. "Which door does it not open?" Adrian offered the faintest hint of a smile, "The one that should never need opening again." Before Charlotte could ask what that meant, a gentle knock sounded against the library doors. This time it came from someone standing outside. Adrian answered without raising his voice. "Come in." The heavy doors opened slowly. An older gentleman dressed in a charcoal suit stepped inside with impeccable posture. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his expression carried the quiet dignity of someone who had served the same family for decades. He bowed respectfully toward Adrian before acknowledging Charlotte with equal courtesy. "Forgive the interruption, sir," he said. "The council representatives have reached the outer gate." Charlotte looked from the gentleman to Adrian. "Council?" Adrian nodded once. "Thank you, Elias. Please escort our guests to the east drawing room. I will receive them shortly." Elias hesitated almost imperceptibly before speaking again. "They specifically requested to meet Miss Hayes." Charlotte felt the room grow noticeably quieter. Adrian's expression remained composed, yet his answer came without hesitation. "That request is denied." Elias inclined his head respectfully. "Very well, sir." The elderly man departed as silently as he had entered, closing the library doors behind him. Charlotte turned toward Adrian. "Who are they?" Adrian walked toward the fireplace before answering. "A group responsible for preserving certain ancient agreements between our world and yours." Charlotte frowned. "Then why do they want to see me?" Adrian rested one hand lightly against the stone mantel. "Because they know someone awakened the first passage." Charlotte looked down at the silver key still resting on the table. "Can they hurt me?" Adrian answered immediately. "Not while you remain here." The certainty in his voice surprised her more than the words themselves. She realized that throughout the evening he had never once asked her to trust him. He had simply continued protecting her without demanding anything in return. Charlotte stepped closer to one of the tall windows overlooking the gardens. Rain shimmered across the white lilies lining every pathway. "Earlier you said other people believed ending your curse was worth any cost." Adrian joined her near the window, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Yes." "Does that include these council representatives?" He considered the question carefully. "Some believe history should remain untouched. Others believe history should finally end." Charlotte watched reflections ripple across the wet stone paths below. "And you?" Adrian remained silent long enough for the answer to become meaningful. "I believe promises should be honored." Charlotte remembered his quiet confession. 400 years ago, I made a promise that I refused to break." The words no longer sounded tragic. They sounded lonely. Her attention drifted toward one of the gardens where dozens of white lilies surrounded a circular fountain. "Those flowers," she said softly. "I keep seeing them." Adrian followed her gaze. "They bloom only when the seal weakens." Charlotte smiled faintly despite herself. "That should not make me feel better, but somehow it does." Adrian looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Why?" She glanced back toward him. "Because every strange thing that has happened since yesterday seemed frightening until someone finally explained part of it." For the first time that evening, genuine warmth softened Adrian's expression. It was brief, almost hidden, yet unmistakably human. At that exact moment, somewhere beyond the library walls, another clock began striking the hour. Unlike the gentle grandfather clock Charlotte had already heard, this one echoed through the entire manor with slow, resonant notes. Adrian's attention shifted immediately toward the sound. "They have entered the house," he said quietly. Charlotte followed his gaze toward the closed library doors, just as an unfamiliar voice calmly spoke from the opposite side of the room. "After 4 centuries, Your Majesty, I had hoped your judgment would be wiser than inviting the key herself into your home." Charlotte slowly turned toward the voice, her fingers instinctively closing around the small silver key Adrian had placed beside her teacup only moments earlier. Standing just inside the library doorway was a distinguished woman dressed in a charcoal grey coat that seemed almost as timeless as the manor itself. Her silver hair rested neatly over one shoulder, and her calm blue eyes studied Charlotte with remarkable precision rather than hostility. 3 equally composed men remained several steps behind her, their expressions respectful and restrained. No one raised a voice, no one reached for a weapon. The tension filling the room came entirely from history rather than aggression. Adrian faced the newcomers with the same quiet authority Charlotte had observed since arriving. "Lady Evelyn," he said evenly, "you entered without waiting for my invitation." The woman inclined her head politely. "Forgive the discourtesy, Your Majesty. Time has become considerably more valuable since this morning." Charlotte immediately recognized the title. "Your Majesty." Until that moment, Adrian had never personally claimed to be a king. He had simply answered questions without embellishment. Hearing someone else address him that way made the truth feel unexpectedly real. Lady Evelyn shifted her attention toward Charlotte. "Miss Hayes, I regret that our first meeting occurs under such unusual circumstances." Charlotte remained cautious but answered politely. "Apparently unusual has become my normal day." A faint smile touched the older woman's face before disappearing. An understandable observation. Adrian stepped slightly forward, not blocking Charlotte, but subtly positioning himself between her and the visitors. It was such a natural movement that Charlotte doubted anyone unfamiliar with him would even notice it. Lady Evelyn certainly did. "You are still protecting the reader first," she observed quietly. Adrian answered without hesitation, "As I always have." Charlotte looked between them. Someone needs to explain what everyone keeps avoiding. Lady Evelyn folded her hands calmly. "Very well." She looked directly at Charlotte. "For 400 years we believed the ancient manuscript existed to imprison an immortal king beneath an unbreakable curse." She paused only briefly. "We were wrong." Charlotte frowned. "Wrong how?" Lady Evelyn glanced toward Adrian before continuing. "The manuscript was never created to imprison him. It was created because he insisted upon becoming the prison." Silence settled across the room. Charlotte slowly turned toward Adrian. He neither interrupted nor corrected the statement. His quiet acceptance revealed more than any denial could have. "The curse was never punishment," Charlotte whispered. Adrian finally spoke. "It was a promise." Charlotte remembered every strange clue she had uncovered. Protect the voice, not the words. The first page is a key. Every generation someone awakened the seal. Every piece suddenly began fitting together. "Then what has been sealed all this time?" she asked softly. Adrian walked toward one of the enormous windows overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. White lilies shimmered beneath lantern light, while the ancient fountain reflected the darkening sky. He remained silent long enough that Charlotte wondered whether he intended to answer at all. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "Long ago, hatred between humans and vampires nearly destroyed both worlds." His voice remained calm, almost reflective. "Many sought power, others sought revenge. Someone eventually created a force that fed upon fear itself. It could not be destroyed, only contained." Charlotte listened without breathing. "So you sealed it?" Adrian nodded once. "Someone had to remain with the seal." Lady Evelyn quietly continued where he left off. "The first passage awakens the ancient bindings every century so they may be renewed. Without a living witness reading the words, the seal slowly weakens." Charlotte blinked. "Every century?" "Yes." "Then why hide the book?" Lady Evelyn answered gently. "Because knowledge fades, curiosity does not. If too many people search for the manuscript, they would eventually discover the chamber itself." Charlotte looked toward Adrian again. "You have remained here all this time." He finally turned back toward her. "Not because I was forced to." His silver-grey eyes held remarkable peace despite the weight of centuries. "Because I gave my word." Charlotte suddenly understood why every anonymous warning had focused on the king instead of the curse. Some people believed releasing him would finally end his burden. Others feared what abandoning the seal might unleash. Neither side seemed entirely wrong. Neither side understood the whole truth. Lady Evelyn carefully removed a weathered envelope from inside her coat and placed it upon the table. "Miss Hayes," she said kindly, "there is one final document that has belonged to the reader of each generation." Charlotte accepted the envelope. Her name had already been written across the front in elegant handwriting that looked impossibly fresh. She slowly opened it and unfolded the single page inside. The message contained only one sentence. "When the time comes, only the reader may choose whether the king remains bound by his promise or is finally released from it." Charlotte slowly lowered the letter as the meaning settled over her. And for the first time that evening, Adrian's calm expression revealed the smallest trace of uncertainty. Charlotte held the letter with both hands, reading the final sentence again as though the words might change if she looked long enough. They did not. The decision described within its elegant handwriting was not symbolic. Every face in the room carried the quiet certainty that the choice would eventually become real. She slowly folded the page and returned it to its envelope before looking toward Adrian. He had spent the entire evening answering every difficult question with remarkable honesty. Yet this was the first time she had seen uncertainty reflected in his silver-grey eyes. It lasted only a moment before his calm expression returned. But it was enough to remind Charlotte that beneath centuries of discipline stood someone who could still hope. Lady Evelyn quietly stepped closer to the fireplace. "The renewal must take place before sunrise," she explained gently. "That has always been the tradition." Charlotte frowned. "Renewal?" Adrian answered before anyone else could. "The first passage awakened the seal. The final passage restores it." Charlotte immediately remembered the ancient manuscript resting safely inside the locked cabinet back at Ashcroft Public Library. "The book is still at the library," Adrian nodded, "exactly where it should remain until the proper moment." Charlotte looked down at the envelope. If I read the final passage, the seal remains strong. Yes, Adrian replied. Then everything continues exactly as it has for 4 centuries, Lady Evelyn quietly added. Unless you choose otherwise, silence returned. Charlotte slowly walked toward the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. The rain had stopped completely. Hundreds of white lilies shimmered beneath silver light while gentle mist drifted above the stone paths. Nothing about the peaceful landscape suggested that an ancient promise had quietly protected it for generations. She thought about Blackwood, about children laughing inside the library earlier that day, about ordinary families walking through streets they believed were perfectly safe. None of them would ever know that someone had silently guarded their future long before they were born. Charlotte finally turned back toward Adrian. Did anyone before me choose to release you? Adrian answered with the same honesty that had defined every conversation between them. No, not one. He slowly shook his head. Every reader reached the same conclusion after learning the truth. Charlotte studied him carefully. Then why leave the choice at all? Because a promise only has meaning if someone remains free to end it. Those words settled deeply within her. He had never viewed the readers as servants to an ancient tradition. They had always remained free to decide for themselves. That freedom transformed obligation into trust. Lady Evelyn quietly approached Charlotte and offered a small leather journal whose worn cover carried the familiar silver crown. This belongs to the readers, she explained. Each generation leaves one final entry before dawn. Charlotte carefully opened the journal. The earliest pages dated back hundreds of years. Every century another unfamiliar name appeared. None of the entries were long. Each consisted of only a few thoughtful paragraphs describing the same realization. They had arrived frightened. They had discovered the truth. They had chosen compassion over convenience. Charlotte turned to the final completed page, written exactly 100 years earlier. The handwriting belonged to the unknown reader from 1923. I came believing I would free a prisoner. I leave knowing I met a guardian. Some burdens deserve gratitude before they deserve release. Charlotte gently closed the journal. Her eyes drifted toward Adrian once more. Throughout the evening he had never once asked to be released. He had never suggested the burden was unfair. He had only ensured that she understood enough to choose freely. That quiet restraint spoke louder than any request ever could. Unfortunately for Charlotte, the decision before her had already begun changing something else. Deep beneath the manor, hidden below layers of ancient stone, the enormous seal surrounding the forgotten chamber pulsed once with soft silver light. The movement was neither violent nor threatening. It simply acknowledged that the final witness now understood the truth. Inside the library, Elias quietly entered and bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty," he said, "the chamber is prepared." Adrian inclined his head. "Thank you." Elias then looked toward Charlotte with calm kindness. "Miss Hayes, whenever you are ready." Charlotte slipped the envelope, the journal, and the small silver key into her shoulder bag before taking one final look around the magnificent library. Only yesterday morning she had believed her life would always revolve around quiet bookshelves and ordinary routines. Now every answer had led her toward one final choice that no one else could make for her. Adrian walked beside her toward the library doors, matching her pace without speaking. Together they stepped into the softly illuminated hallway leading toward the ancient chamber, where 4 centuries of faith, sacrifice, and hope had quietly waited for the arrival of one ordinary librarian. Charlotte followed Adrian through a series of quiet corridors that seemed untouched by ordinary time. Every hallway was illuminated by warm lanterns instead of electric lights, casting soft reflections across polished stone floors that had welcomed countless footsteps over the centuries. Yet no portraits watched them here, no servants waited behind carved doors. The deeper they walked beneath the manor, the simpler everything became, until only silence remained. At the end of the final corridor stood an ancient oak door reinforced with silver bands weathered by age rather than neglect. Charlotte immediately recognized the intricate crown surrounded by thorn-like branches carved into its center. Without speaking, she reached into her shoulder bag, and Mr. Alden had entrusted to her. Adrian looked at it with quiet recognition. "He kept it," he said softly. Charlotte nodded. "He told me it opened one important door." Adrian stepped aside. "Then it belongs in your hands." Charlotte carefully inserted the key into the weathered lock. It turned with remarkable ease, as though the mechanism had been waiting only for that single touch. The heavy door opened without resistance. revealing a circular chamber unlike any place she had ever imagined. There were no treasures, no throne, no forgotten prison. The room was surprisingly peaceful. At its center stood a single stone pedestal surrounded by white lilies growing directly from the polished floor without soil or sunlight. Resting upon the pedestal was the ancient manuscript she had discovered beneath Ashcroft Public Library, its black cloth now neatly folded beside it. Charlotte stared in surprise. "The book," Adrian nodded gently. "It always returns here when the witness understands its purpose." Soft silver light drifted across the carved ceiling, tracing countless symbols that resembled branches joining together into one unbroken circle. The air felt cool but welcoming, carrying the faint scent of cedar rain and old parchment. Lady Evelyn, Elias, and the remaining council members quietly entered behind them but remained respectfully near the doorway. No one approached the pedestal. No one attempted to influence Charlotte. The choice truly belonged to her alone. She slowly walked toward the manuscript until she stood only a few feet away. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the polished stone beneath her shoes. "What happens if I read the final passage?" she asked. Adrian answered calmly from where he stood. "The promise continues." Charlotte rested one hand lightly upon the ancient cover. "And if I refuse," Adrian did not hesitate, "the seal gradually fades. Eventually I would be free to leave." Charlotte turned toward him. "After 400 years, do you want that?" The chamber became completely silent. Adrian looked around the room that had shaped centuries of his existence before meeting Charlotte's eyes once more. "There have been many mornings when I dreamed of seeing the world without responsibility waiting beside me." His quiet voice carried neither bitterness nor regret. "But every generation of children who grew up safely, every family who lived ordinary lives, every peaceful season this valley has known reminded me why the promise mattered." Charlotte felt emotion rise unexpectedly inside her chest. He was not choosing sacrifice because he believed he deserved suffering. He remained because countless strangers would never know the gift they had quietly received. She gently opened the manuscript. Unlike before, the unfamiliar symbols no longer shifted or shimmered. Every word already appeared in clear modern English, as though the book itself knew she finally understood its purpose. Charlotte took one slow breath and began reading the final passage aloud. Her voice remained steady, filling the circular chamber with calm rather than fear. Each sentence echoed softly through the ancient stone before fading into complete silence. As the final words left her lips, the silver light surrounding the ceiling slowly gathered above the pedestal before flowing downward like gentle morning sunlight. It surrounded the manuscript, the lilies, and finally Adrian himself. No violent force appeared, no terrifying spectacle unfolded. Instead, the entire chamber seemed to exhale after centuries of patient waiting. The lilies bloomed fully in perfect silence. The carved symbols across the ceiling glowed once before gradually returning to ordinary stone. Charlotte closed the manuscript carefully. The leather felt cool beneath her fingertips. Lady Evelyn quietly smiled. Elias lowered his head in gratitude. Adrian looked at Charlotte with an expression she had never seen before. Not relief, not surprise. It was simple, heartfelt gratitude that required no words. Outside the chamber, the first light of dawn gently appeared beyond the eastern hills, and for the first time in 400 years the ancient seal no longer pulsed with strain. It rested peacefully, strengthened not by fear or obligation, but by a choice freely given. Morning sunlight slowly spilled across the eastern hills, washing Ashcroft Manor in warm gold instead of the cold silver glow that had welcomed Charlotte only hours before. The estate no longer felt like a forgotten fortress hidden from history. It felt like a home that had quietly carried its duty with grace for far longer than anyone could remember. The white lilies surrounding the ancient chamber remained fully open, petals gently moving in the fresh morning breeze drifting through newly opened windows. Lady Evelyn and the council members stood together near the entrance, not celebrating, but honoring a tradition completed exactly as it had been intended. One by one, they offered Adrian respectful bows before quietly departing without another word. Their footsteps faded until only Charlotte and Adrian remained inside the peaceful chamber. Neither hurried to leave. After everything that had happened, silence no longer felt uncomfortable between them, it felt earned. Charlotte looked toward the ancient manuscript resting upon the stone pedestal. The worn leather cover appeared completely ordinary now. The silver crown no longer shimmered. The mysterious warmth had disappeared. It had become what it had always hoped to be, simply a book. She smiled softly. It finally looks like it belongs in a library again. Adrian followed her gaze. Perhaps that was always its true home. Together they walked back through the quiet corridors toward the entrance hall. Morning light filled every window, revealing details Charlotte had not noticed the previous evening. Fresh flowers decorated long tables. Family portraits hung beside landscapes instead of towering above visitors. The manor no longer felt intimidating. Without the weight of uncertainty pressing upon her, she could finally appreciate the kindness hidden inside its quiet beauty. At the front entrance, the same black sedan waited patiently beside the stone steps. The driver respectfully opened the rear door, prepared to return Charlotte to Blackwood. She paused before stepping outside. "Will I remember all of this?" she asked. Adrian smiled gently. Charlotte looked surprised. "I have a choice? You always did." She thought for only a moment before quietly laughing. "I spent my entire life surrounded by books because I believed every story deserved to be remembered." Adrian nodded with quiet understanding. "Then I believe you already have your answer." Charlotte stepped closer and extended her hand. Adrian accepted it without hesitation. His handshake was warm, steady, and unmistakably human. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Not for telling me the truth, for trusting me with it." Adrian looked toward the bright horizon beyond the manor gates. "Thank you for reminding me that keeping a promise does not mean carrying it alone." Charlotte entered the waiting car, and moments later the estate slowly disappeared behind towering maples as the road carried her back toward Blackwood. When she arrived at Ashcroft Public Library, the familiar grandfather clock quietly chimed 9 o'clock with perfect accuracy. Children hurried toward the reading corner, carrying colorful picture books. College students filled the reference tables. Mr. Alden smiled warmly from his ladder while repairing a loose shelf, exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet when Charlotte quietly placed the ancient manuscript onto a display cart awaiting archival restoration, the old custodian simply looked at her, nodded once, and returned to his work without asking a single question. Some stories, he understood, never needed explaining. Weeks passed. Autumn slowly gave way to winter. The strange events faded into memory, but certain small reminders remained. Every Tuesday morning, Charlotte still unlocked the library before anyone else arrived. She still opened the tall windows to welcome fresh air. She still switched on each brass reading lamp one by one. Occasionally she discovered a single white lily resting quietly near the entrance before sunrise. No note ever accompanied it. None was necessary. On the first warm afternoon of spring, Charlotte carried a stack of returned history books toward the front desk when she noticed a familiar figure standing near the window overlooking the town square. Adrian held an ordinary library card between his fingers while calmly studying a shelf of classic literature. No grand entrance announced his arrival. No mysterious music filled the room. He looked exactly like any other visitor searching for a good book. Charlotte smiled before walking over. "Can I help you find something?" Adrian returned the smile with quiet warmth. "Actually," he replied, looking around the peaceful library, "I was hoping you might recommend a story worth reading." Outside, children laughed beneath blooming trees while sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows exactly as it had on the morning this extraordinary journey began. Only now Charlotte understood something she had not known then. The greatest stories were never about ancient curses or forgotten kings. They were about ordinary acts of kindness that quietly changed the lives of people willing to protect hope long after the rest of the world had forgotten it. And as she led Adrian toward the shelves lined with countless unwritten possibilities, the old library felt exactly as it always had, except that this time both of them knew they had already become one of its most beautiful stories.